Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. It's an honor to introduce Vincent Lepetit. He's got his PhD in 2001 from University of Nancy, and he worked at the ESA INRIA team. Then he joined the virtual reality lab at EPFL, and he became a co-founding member of the computer vision lab there. And he's been, I think, a driving force there ever since, and produced some exciting work, not the least of all. He won a Best Paper Award at CVPR 2005, and he will tell us about this work and more recent work at EPFL. So, stage is all yours.
Okay. Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. So I'll present three different works, maybe four if I have time, but most probably only three. So we'll start with something which is relatively old right now, which is about efficient key point recognition, and three other works which are actually related to this first work. So yeah, so the first of this work will be on key point recognition. And so when I'm talking about key point recognition, is key point extraction and rectification using affine regions and characterization with SIFT. So if I summarize as a standard approach by these different steps. So first, people extract feature points, so you can use Hessian Laplace detectors or any detector. You can rectify the patch centered on your key point on a canonical representation using the affine region transformation. Then you compute some descriptor. So nowadays everybody is using SIFT. And if you want to match your first feature point, you will match it against a database of descriptor of this feature point. So that's the standard approach that everybody is following. So we started by saying that you can see this standard approach as a classification process. So where the first steps, where you rectify your patch and compute the SIFT descriptor, is some kind of pre-processing when you make the classification easier. So basically you start by from this kind of patches to the SIFT descriptor, which summarize all your information but remove some variation. And so it's a good representation of your patch. And the last step is, so the search in the database is usually a nearest neighbor classification, because you use the Euclidean distance on your descriptors to match the descriptors. So we say that since you can see that as a classification process, let's really do classification. And so that's what I will present. And since I'm talking about classification, so I will have classes somewhere. And in our problem, or in our specification of the problem, we'll have one class for each feature point. And the class is made of all the possible appearances of the feature points when I change the position of my object, when I rotate my object, when I change the light, I add noise, and this kind of stuff. So I have one class for each feature point on the object I would like to detect. So we'll proceed a bit differently than other people. We have a first training phase where we show to a classifier the different, some examples of the classes, and to build the classifier. And once the classifier is built, I can use it at runtime to recognize my feature points. And so I can show very quickly a demo on what it does. So it's maybe not really impressive anymore because it's something relatively old now, but so I can. So the circles you see in this image are feature points that are extracted just extreme of Laplacians, but that's something standard, doesn't really care. And so I have trained my classifier to recognize feature points on my object. So the white circles are the feature points that are recognized by the classifier, and once I recognize those feature points, it's easy to find the position of the object. So it's so I can recognize the feature points under rotation, but also some scale variation and some perspective transformation.
What makes it take the decision that it has not recognized a feature point? Is it a racial test? Or
Yeah. That's on just the output. The classifier can output a measure of how do you call that? Of probability to decide if it's really this feature point or not. That's we get probabilities out of the classifier, so it's really easy to have a threshold on that. It's easy to fix a threshold on that. Yeah. Yeah. That's we have to train the classifier on this object.
I mean, do you have similar image of this, or you just have some other similar image?
You mean to train the classifier?
Right. I mean, just said that do you have this image, exact image in database, or you just?
Yeah. I have one image of my object, and the classifier needs several images, several examples. So because it's a planar object, I just synthesize new images, but it's because it's easy. And but if we, so I will present also the same thing but on 3D objects, and then we'll need several views of the object. Yeah. So I can go back to the presentation. So I just move forward. And so we use this to have one application of what is called a magic book. So I can give you an example. So it was done by it's a work was done by a design artist. So who just received the, I think it's called the best design diploma, best European design diploma. And what she did was to reuse exactly this kind of demo to have what is called a magic book. So with augmented object on the book. So it's a good direct application of this kind of work. And it's a very nice work. It's really good looking, so I like it. Okay, maybe one more. And another more maybe.
Is it a 2D augmentation?
Yeah, there it's only 2D, but because it was easier for her to do the design in 2D, and she preferred 2D things. But then I have a 3D. If it works, it's probably a bit slow, but yeah. Oops. So now it's really in 3D. So that's something which was done by a French company which is called Total Immersion. So they do stuff in augmented reality in general. So maybe using vision, but not only vision. And so that's the kind of thing they do with our code. They add that's more for public relation, for advertisement, so people can play with the book with a nice augmented reality objects and stuff like that. So yeah, it's getting popular. They like this kind of thing. So it's really a direct application of the kind of things we did. So yeah, so now we will talk about the method and the classifier itself. So we designed a new classifier which is specialized for this kind of problem, and we call it ferns because it's okay, it's closely related to a classification tree, so it's okay. Anyway, so just formally, what we want to do is, given a patch, we want to find the class, so the feature points on my object that maximize this probability. That's something very very simple actually. So I will just represent my patch as a set of features, my Fi over there, that can be computed on my patch. And with just the bias rule, with a good assumptions, I can assume that this probability is proportional to this one, and that's empirical probability, something I can estimate if I have enough examples and enough memory to store the probabilities. My problem is I will use very simple features because they are very simple to and very fast to compute on my patches. And the problem is I have a lot of them, and because I have a lot of them, I will need many and too many examples and too much memory to store the results into my computer. So what we did, before, if you take a naive Bayesian approach, you can just say that this probability can be approximated by a product like that, where you assume that all the features are independent with each other. Because my features are too simple, this assumption is not true. They are not independent with each other. So what we did is something really just something in between, a trade-off, where we split this big set of features into small subsets of features, and the subsets are independent enough between the two different between each other, so that I can split my big probability like that as a product like that. And so graphically, I can represent the same thing like that. So for each term of my product in the bottom of the slide before, I will represent a structure, a vertical structure like that. So at the top of the structure, I will represent my features. I can compute on my patch. So I say that the features are the features we are using are very simple. We just compare the intensities of 2 pixels in the patch. And so that's something which is very fast to compute, but also very robust to light changes. If I change the intensity by an increasing function, the features will remain will have the same value. And at the bottom of my structure, I just have the posterior probability given the features. Yeah.
The problem is that this inequality is not very good on the noise.
Yeah, that's true. So we tried to use Gaussian smoothing before applying before computing the features, which solve some problems. But actually, it's not really needed, because what we'll do is to train the classifier with noise, with also noisy patches, and we'll change the noise, of course. And in practice, is still robust to noise, because we'll train the classifier with many examples with different levels of noise. And in practice, it works quite well. And yeah, so that's my posterior probabilities I will estimate during my training stage. So I do that for each term of my product. So to train my classifier, I just have to take patches that are centered on my feature points. I compute the features on these patches, and for this combination of features, I know that this class is more likely. So it's easy to find the place in the memory that correspond to this combination of features. I just have to concat the different values, because that's binary values for the features, and I get an index somewhere in the memory. So I know that this combination of features is more likely for this class than the other combination of features. So I just have to add somewhere to increment somewhere a counter in my memory. And I do that for all my terms. And I will repeat that for many examples for all my classes. And at some point, when I decide that my training phase is finished, I get something like that, where I find the association between the response of my features and the probability over classes. So I still have to normalize to be sure that over this thing represents a distribution. And I can use these probabilities to estimate, to recognize now a patch at runtime. So when I want to recognize a patch which comes from my input image, I just have to compute my features on this patch. So it's exactly the same story. It's just the same kind of computation as for the training phase. Each term gives me probability for each of the possible classes, and I just have to compute the product term by term, which comes the product term from the product of my at the bottom of my previous slide. And so I compute the product term by term if the probabilities were correctly estimated, I get a peak for the class that correspond to my input patch, to this one. So that's something which is very simple. I just have to apply to compute my features and look at into my memory to get the probabilities and just compute the different terms. So that's something which is very efficient and very fast and very simple to implement. So we had a paper at CVPR which was called Key Point Recognition in 10 lines of code, and we actually gave the C code for the recognition. So of course we are cheating because that's only the code for the recognition. There is not the code for generating the images or extracting the feature points. But really, the recognition is really done in these lines of code. So the cool thing is, the best thing maybe about that, it's very easy very simple to implement. It does not depend on parameters you have to tune and this kind of thing. And everything is done or not everything, but most of the thing is done by the classifier. You don't have to rectify for the orientation or for the perspective. You don't have to compute a canonical orientation or use an affine region to correct for the perspective. And that's something very fast because we just have two for loops. So that basically the CPU is happy when it sees these loops.
I'm missing.
Yep.
How do you get the rotation invariance?
Because we show the classifier the same patch but under different orientation. And the classifier is powerful enough to learn this kind of thing, which is kind of surprising because we have a lot of variations when we rotate a patch, but it's still giving good things. So one thing I didn't talk about is the way we choose the features. So the FI, so basically the locations of the pixel. And what is interesting is we realize that we don't have to optimize on the location of the pixels. We can take this location at random, and I will try to justify why we don't have to optimize on that and just take random features works good enough. And so if we add a relatively standard problem with a relatively small number of classes and not too much variation within classes, when you have to select a feature to classify basically this kind of problems, you can try different. So if let's say that we have very simple features, hyperplanes, like in our case, you can try different hyperplanes to split your classes into well separated classes. So if you have a relatively simple problems like this one, you can try different hyperplanes, different features, and pick the best ones. And let's say that you have a criterion to estimate how well you split your classes. So in that case, it's relatively easy to find an hyperplane that separates well your classes. In our problem, we have much more classes. Typically, we have a few thousand feature points, and with very large variation within the classes. It's a very large variation because what I said, when you rotate a patch, the patch can move a lot within the image space. So we have a much more complex problem where the things are much more crowded. And let's say that now I do the same thing. I tried hyperplanes to separate my classes. And what will happen there is because it's really very spread on the image space, any hyperplane will do more or less the same job. It will do a good It will do a good job to separate some of the classes and do a bad job because it will split one class into two different parts. And so one hyperplane will do a good job for some classes, a bad job for some other classes, and so there is no point into optimizing because all of them will do more or less the same job. And if you put enough of these hyperplanes together, you will separate the space in a good enough way so that the classifier will do something good. And I have another graphical interpretation of what is going on. So each of my rectangles over there represent the image space, also the patch space, and these lines are the hyperplanes, so the features in my fern. So each rectangle corresponds to each of the fern, so each of the product in each term of my product. So each feature separates the image space in two, and when I put several features together, I have a splitting of my image space. And when I do the training, I compute the probabilities over each of these parts like that. I compute the probability for each of the class, and when I compute the product, I combine the different splitting, and so I get a relatively fine cut of the image space where I have the probability distribution, and so when I put the things together, I have a decent approximation of the probability of the distribution over the image space. And so that's for one class. And because I compute also the distribution for all the classes, I get something like that. So, which is I estimated the distribution for each of the classes over the image space. I reuse exactly the same splitting for all the classes, but of course I have different probabilities for the different parts. So I estimate a different distribution. So yeah, so that's just a graphical interpretation of what's going on.
Sorry, I lost the context of.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I can go back. So that's a representation of what how can I say? Each of these rectangles represent a term in my product at the bottom of my slide. So that means I've estimated after training, I've estimated a probability for this class over different parts of the image space. Each of these lines represent a feature. And a feature it's a binary feature, so I split the image space in two with one of the features. So when I put several features together for my product, I get how do you call that? Anyway, I splitted my image space in several parts. Okay, so, and when I compute the product, I will compute the product term by term in between these different regions. So I get a distribution which is relative. So I combine all the splits of my image space in with very fine with finer parts at the beginning. Okay, and so that's why it's interesting to do the combination. I get something which is much finer than just one term of my product.
When you did this, were you inspired by all these locality-sensitive hashing ideas? Because it's sort of...
Yeah, it's definitely it's related. It's not exactly the same kind of approach, but at the end you get something which is definitely very related. Yeah. And yeah, so that's it. And what I represent there is we reuse the same regions for the different classes. So you see it's the same borders there for the different classes. But so we reuse the same splitting of the image space to represent the different distribution for each of the classes. Is it more clear? Yeah. Okay. So, oops, sorry. So as I said, so we use the same approach for 3D objects. So when it was a planar object, it was very easy because we need several training images. It's easy to generate by just synthesizing them new training images if it's a planar object. If it's a 3D object, it's more complex to generate training images. So what we did was to take a movie of the object we want to track and train the system, train the classifier to recognize this car for this example over a small range of viewpoints. And so we get a classifier which is good enough to find the car, so the same object, in the next image in the sequence, and incrementally we can train the classifier, which is another good thing in the fact that we can take the features at random. We can do incremental training. So that's the kind of things we can do. So it's the same story. We detect the object from scratch for each image independently. So it's not really tracking; it's really detection in each image. So when the car is too far, we lost it because we don't detect enough feature points on it. But when the camera comes back closer to the car, we can detect it, and we really get the 3D location of the car. And we did another thing for this object. So while we were training the classifier over the sequence, we also tracked feature points and then did a bundle adjustment to reconstruct the shape of the car. And yeah, so as I said, it's relatively robust to light changes.
So that's done before this, or is it done on the first couple of frames? Or
Sorry. No, we have a first training sequence where the car moves relatively slowly, so something which is very simple to track. And we use this first video sequence to train the classifier, and once it's done, we freeze the classifier. We don't modify it anymore, and we can use it on the object. Yeah. Okay, so I will go to the next part if you don't have any questions. So the motivation for this new work was to try to get rid of too much textured objects. So we had what I presented before was working nicely because we used very nicely textured object, but we wanted to work on let's say, less textured object. So object where we can still have feature points on them, but not too much. So something like that, where there is no so many feature points, but still we still have some feature points. The idea was to reuse the deformation of the patch, which is centered on the feature points. So let's say that I consider a feature point which is extracted at the bottom of my V there. And just from the way the patch is deformed, I get a very good idea of the pose of the wall object. So the idea was to not use only the 2D locations of the feature points, but also the texture and the appearance to compute the pose. And just from one feature point, I get a very good idea of the pose of the object. So that's something which is that's the thing which is represented in red over there. And from the red position, it's easy to refine the position to get the blue one, which is the correct pose of the object. So and that's something we can do with just one feature point, which is interesting in practice if you want to deal with less textured object. And just to give you an idea of, and so that's something which is also in real time. I'm sorry I don't have the demo to show you, but it's really also in real time. So the yellow squares are so the orientation of the feature points that are computed, and that's the same story. Everything is recomputed from scratch.
Is the outline a detection, or it just shows where you think the whole object is?
And this border,
Yes.
it's computed from the feature points. Yeah. No, it's really estimated. Yeah. Yeah, there is no edge detection or something. It's really the estimation of the. So it's robust to relatively large viewpoint, large perspective deformation, and it's not like affine regions. We really get the full perspective transformation. Affine region, of course, is limited to affine transformation. We already get a perspective transformation, and what is interesting is we are robust to very strong occlusions. Oops. Okay, I will continue. So we tried different approaches for that. I will show the last one and the current last one. And our approach is divided in two steps. So we'll have a first step where we first we first recognize the feature points, so know which class it comes from, and estimate a coarse pose, so coarse deformation of the patch, and then we'll refine the position. What I call the pose, but really it's a pose of the feature point. So first a coarse pose, and then I do some refinement. And so in the last approach, what we did is to consider the feature points which is over there, and divide the set of possible poses into subsets. So that's what I represented over there. And we just compute the mean of the patch when we change the pose of the pose of the object within a small subset, a small range of the feature point of the pose. So, and we get a mean which looks something like that. So that's something very simple. And so we compute a set of means for different positions. So we get something like that. Yeah.
So it's like geometric blurring.
Yeah, I think geometric blurring is what, just with a Gaussian, or is Gaussian smoothing?
Becomes harsher and harsher as you go out from the second one.
Yeah, but it's definitely it's related, but there we already have the geometric part, because we already do the warping. I think to call that the geometric blurring. Yeah, it's you maybe don't have this notion of really geometric transformation. I think it just so really it's but definitely it's related. In practice, it works relatively well because it's robust to noise and robust to blur, of course, because we work on with min images, and we don't have to compute any for the incoming points from the input image. We don't have to compute any descriptor. We just have to match the patch on the means. So it's something relatively simple, but we have a trick to compute these means because we want them to be computed very quickly, because we want to do that in as fast as possible, if possible in real time. So if you heard about this trick, I would be happy to heard about it. Hopefully something new, but I'm not completely confident. But yeah, so I will present how we compute the mean patch over a range of poses. So it's where I can write it like that, where my W is the warping function. So just take the original patch and I warp it. I will explain why I crop a part just like that. So the W is my warping function. Pi is the original patch. So this one, and H, the H's are the poses. And for each, that will change when I compute the mean. So what we do is to first decompose the original patch in a PCA decomposition. So that's something what I wrote there. So when we do that, of course, we gain nothing, but it will be interesting for to go further, and if we realize that the W, the warping function, is a linear function. So that's I don't know if it's something obvious, but that's at least something interesting. So by a linear function, I mean if I take the vector, a way to see that is, let's say that I take a vector of this patch. So that's something I write like that. And I take a version of the warped patch like that, and I make a vector out of it. So I get something like that. And there is actually a matrix which transforms this vector of the original patch into the vector for the warped patch.
The real situation is a lot more complicated than that, because typically what happens when you do resampling is you anti-alias it by prefix.
Yeah.
So that's no longer linear.
Yeah, it's probably not completely linear, or it's linear enough for our problem. It's not probably if you have complex interpolation for the warping. I agree. It's probably
any interpolation is a combination of pixels, right?
If you
say, okay, I'll take some of this, some of that.
Yeah,
it's maybe very complex, but
if you do a linear interpolation to create the warp patch, I think it's any interpolation or.
Sorry, as long as you don't actually, yeah, I'm not so sure.
If it's a linear interpolation, definitely there is no problem. And if it's something more complex than a linear interpolation.
Cubic interpolation, say take square of this pixel and take half of this pixel. I don't think so, is it?
No, it's not.
You just
Which cubic is not really. You get coefficients that is power of that's not linear.
But the coefficients are take the exponent, not the pixels.
Right, but the problem is the ideal interpolator is a sinc function, right?
Yeah.
So obviously in practice it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's maybe it's not a perfect linear linear transformation, but still a linear transformation would make a good enough patch. So I can show you what we did to check that. So we took a set of twinning patches. So where that the big one represents an original patch, and we warped it and crop it. So we have to crop it because we have to remove the parts that does not appear into the original patch. We don't want new things going on going into the new patch. But so we took a lot of training pairs of patches, where is my original patch and the warped one. And by just doing regression, I can compute a matrix that transform the vectors for this patch into a vector for this patch. And when I take this matrix, so computed by regression, and I multiply the vector for a new patch, I get a version of my warped patch. So which is convincing enough, good enough in terms of recognition, at least. So yeah, so it's interesting to simplify my previous sum, where I decompose my original patch into a PCA decomposition. So okay, I can skip the equations, or that's something very simple, but we get so the mean can be computed as a weighted sum of the means computed for the eigenvectors.
So is this a PCA trained on lots of natural images? Or
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we get the eigenvectors, and we just have to compute the means for the different eigenvectors, and we just have to recombine the means for the eigenvectors. So that's what I wrote over there. And so what is interesting is we don't depend on the number of samples we used to compute the mean of the eigenvectors, not at runtime. Once we have computed the mean for the eigenvectors, when we have a new point which is coming to the system, we just have to compute this sum, which is a relatively small, short sum. And the refinement is something relatively simple. We just use a template matching technique where we learn. So let's say that's my course pose given by the previous step, and so I just apply a few iterations of that looks like that, where A is actually a matrix learned by regression. So from between the differences of the appearance of the patches, and so we just have to multiply the difference of patches by a matrix, and from that we get the displacement, or not the displacements of the corners of the patches. So that's something we can also learn, and it's really efficient and very robust, because it's not like a Gauss-Newton optimization or something. We avoid the local minimum, and so in practice it works quite well. So I can show you a last video on this last. So what we do there. So So the computation time is not really relevant, but what we do there is to select a few points. So the orange square is just to select a few points by n. And so for example, we just selected one, and the system is trained. So we computed the mean and the matrices for the regression. So it's very fast. So that's something we can do online. And that's something which is very robust. So when you see the square which is appearing, it's not a false positive or something. It's just for the graphical interface, which is probably not very good. But so you can see it's the quality of the images are very bad. It's just a poor webcam, and it's quite robust. It's quite stable. And it's robust to noise and to also to blur in the images, thanks to the means, and also to the regression we use for the rectification. So
how did you get training there for the 3D poses?
because it's a planar object there, so it's we just have to synthesize. Yeah, if it's locally planar, it's okay. Yeah. So we have some tricks to do the regression very quickly. We don't have to actually synthesize the image. We just have to warp the locations and so on, which is faster.
How do you get the normal from the BGC planes?
Yeah, there we assume that we have a frontal view of the object. There we select the points by hand. So we just have to select a view where the object is frontal parallel.
That envelope on the floor. First,
When I can try to replay the video. When we select the view, when we first see the point, the view was frontal parallel enough so that we can get the normal. Yeah, we need frontal views. If it's not a frontal view, we'll get the homography between the original view and so not really the 3D.
You see we know the focal length, otherwise you don't know.
I agree. Yeah.
Normal.
Yeah. We are used to do 3D tracking, so in this kind of thing, we assume that we know the internal parameters. Yes, I agree. We need the internal parameters. And okay, so,
Question
yeah.
in this section. So it's fairly known, I think, that if you do PCA on natural images, you get something that looks like a DCT.
Yeah, exactly.
So is it reasonable intuition that what's happening here is we're looking at how different frequencies change as you change the viewpoints on them?
No, not really, because it depends on. I agree. You will probably have more high frequencies when you look at.
The whole thing with mapping a PCA linearly through the warp, I'm thinking that it's kind of like looking at how each frequency goes through the warp and changes how it's. We can discuss it.
Yeah, but okay, I think it's not relevant. It does not. Oh, it's not relevant. It does not change the results. But yeah, there's probably something going on. I agree that if you, so in the warped version, in the means, you will get higher frequencies. You will increase the frequencies. Yeah, there's something probably interesting to look at. It does not change. Yeah.
Just one final comment. Since you assume you know the intrinsics of the camera,
Yeah.
technically you're quantizing over the rotation space, not homography.
Actually, that's what we do. We quantize over rotations, and we use homographies because we use the homography internally to do the warping. But yeah, actually, yeah, the discrete.
It's much more restricted space.
I agree. We do the discretization using the rotation. Yeah, I agree. But yeah, I'm talking about homography because it's easier for warping. But the discretization is done on the rotation. I agree. Yeah, it's much better, definitely. So yeah, so we will finish on something which was done with Engin, which is also related, but a different kind of applications. So that's about dense wide baseline 3D reconstruction. And so the idea was, let's say that I want to do a 3D reconstruction of two images of relatively bad quality. And so let's say that I take these two calibrated images, so I know the calibration of the camera. I just want to match the two images. And so the ground truth looks something like that. And let's say that you take a standard approach, which is a graph cut to do the optimization and the pixel differences to do the matching. And if the baseline is too wide between the two images, if you have noise in your images and stuff like that, you can get a very bad results. So that's something we got, which is just the standard approach, graph cut plus pixel difference. It's not really good because we are in a wide baseline, especially because we are in wide baseline context. And so I would say it's our first contribution is to. We propose to use a descriptor, so instead of just comparing the pixels, the images pixel by pixel, use a local descriptor to do the matching. So we will still keep all the graph cut optimization, but we just change the image measure, and let's say that we could use a descriptor because we have all this nice work on white baseline descriptors. So we tried using SIFT as a descriptor, and definitely the reconstruction is much better, at least much more robust. We already get the actual, or a good idea of the actual shape of the object we are looking at. Of course, it's still difficult, so we are still missing some parts of the object, but still we have some improvement. Yeah, so it's not perfect everywhere. And what we did was to propose a new descriptor, which is interesting to use in a dense framework. So we'll have a descriptor which is fast to compute in a dense way over the images, and which is probably more suited for 3D reconstruction as compared to SIFT. So we call our descriptor DAISY. And so as you see, the results we get at least on this scene are smoother and better in general. Of course, which is also interesting. It's very fast, and we can probably do faster, but we'll discuss that. So let's say that. So the main point is to compute the descriptor in a fast way, in a dense way, and in an efficient way. So let's say that I want to compute SIFT on every location in my image. So I won't consider the rotation now, but let's say that I will compute SIFT for this location with this kind of rotation. So I get the descriptor like that. And if I want to compute the descriptor for the pixel, which is for the location which is next to this first location, of course I could reuse some computation for the descriptor of the previous location. So SIFT is not done like that, but I could modify SIFT so that it would do this kind of thing, which I could share different parts of the descriptors that would overlap. Which is problematic is when you start rotating your descriptor, things becomes much more complex. It's much more difficult to share computations for the descriptors that would overlap in the SIFT approach. So I will explain our descriptor now. So the first idea was to change the histograms for the computation. Yeah, I will to change the computation of the histograms using Gaussian kernels, and take the shape of the glow descriptor. And so we combine basically these two ideas, and we ended up with a descriptor which has this shape. So unfortunately, some people published something before on this kind of descriptor before us. But yeah, that was something we were developing. Yeah, I know. no, I know. So that's something we were developing when the paper was published at CVPR.
Great minds think alike.
Sorry?
Great minds think alike.
Exactly. And but Simon and Matthew did all this work on the optimization on the shape of the descriptor. So but we just did that intuitively, and something that would make sense. And yeah, so that means that we just have to compute the gradients for each pixel of the image, and convolve the gradient images with some Gaussian. And when we want to get the value of our descriptor, we just have to pick the value inside these smooth images. So that's something much easier. So when we have to rebuild the descriptor, we just have to pick the values at the right place, at the center of the circle represented for the descriptor. And so the Gaussian smoothing is interesting because first, they are probably more robust to noise than histograms, because with smooth and Gaussian smoothing is interesting for Gaussian noise. And also we just have to apply convolutions and 1D convolutions actually to compute the convolutions, the smoothing. And if we want to compute to have large kernels, we just have to convolve the images several times, and we just have to compose the different convolutions. So that makes the thing very fast to compute when we want to compute it on all over the image. And yeah, just to before I show the results, since the descriptor is relatively large and can overlap parts of the scene that are maybe occluded in the other image, we have something where we can estimate the different parts of the descriptor that can be the parts that can be occluded in the other image. So we have an iterative process in the GraphCut to estimate which parts are maybe occluded. So that's something necessary if you want to use that for dense 3D reconstruction. And we also have a prior on the occlusion mask because or the parts should be connected and this kind of thing. So that's the kind of results we get. So we wanted to work on relatively low quality images. So that's definitely not the images that people who do 3D reconstruction are using. We wanted to have a relatively low resolution, bad conditions. So typically, this one has strong contrast changes. So it's still the same illumination, right? But And so on this column is results obtained with normalized cross correlation or with a small window. This last column is using SIFT. So so this one is contrast changes. This one has very different scales, and this one has low resolution. So it was shot with a mobile phone or webcam. And that's the results we get with DAISY. Yeah, in general, it's not perfect because we still have some holes and some errors in the reconstruction. But definitely, the global shape is really recovered. And I would say, if we want a nice or a better reconstruction, we can start from that to refine and to get finer details. And okay, so I will stop. We'll stop. Yeah.
Yeah, when Pascal visited, I kind of told him, what I'm going to ask you about is the problem with DAISY is that it handles rotation. It doesn't handle perspective distortion, as you would expect when you have white baseline. So can you comment on that?
I agree it's not perfect. We can. It's not done yet, but but we can. At least we can change the locations where we look at in the Gaussian in the smooth images. So we can at least deform the descriptor so that we get the perspective deformation. It won't. Ideally, we should also change the computation of the gradients, but it will not be very efficient. But at least we can deform the locations of the descriptors, and it should be not too bad in the sense that ideally we should also deform the kernels of the Gaussians so that they are not isotropic, but not isotropic anymore, but also with an ellipse shape. But yeah, that would not be very efficient.
Actually, yeah, we are experimenting on defining a normal, instead of searching in the depth space, we also search in the normal space so that you can deform the positions of the various sample and deform the Gaussians. Yeah, we are also doing that too right now, but it's experimental. Yes.
That's two parts of the problem. We need an estimation of the normal of the scene, and from the normal, we also need to deform the descriptor correctly so that we get the good matching.
We have this occlusion mask estimation step inside the graph cut. We can also add there a normal term and look for the normal too, and based on the normal in the next iteration, work the descriptor, get the new scores like that.
Yeah, we can take this offline.
Yeah.
I have other comments.
Okay. Thank you.